Thank you very, very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Uria, and I'm a member of the Cleveland Israel Arts Connection Advisory Committee. I'm delighted to welcome you here today to a virtual artist salon with Ron Leshem. Before we get started, I thought it would be appropriate just for me to say a couple of words with what is going on in Israel. We stand with our family in Israel who find themselves against the target of systematic and escalating terrorist attacks. We strongly condemn the reckless rocket fire and balloon attacks by Hamas and other terrorist groups from Gaza towards civilians inside Israel. Israel, like any sovereign nation, has a duty to protect its residents. We mourn the loss of all innocent life and wish refuah shalema to those injured. We hope for a quick resolution to this crisis. May the day come soon when peace is restored and life without fear can return. As many of you know, the goal of the Cleveland Israel Arts Connection is to connect our community with the most dynamic 21st century cultural experiences that Israel has to offer. In 10 years, we have helped bring over 100 Israeli artists to Cleveland and partnered with 50 fine art organizations. These include all the arts: film, music, visual art, literature, theater, dance, fashion and design, and even the culinary arts. If you have not received the spring-summer brochure of virtual arts events, please visit jewishcleveland.org for a digital copy. Before we begin, I want to extend a few thank yous. Sorry, 1 second, I'm having a technical issue here. First, a sincere thank you to Ro Green, honorary producer and co-chair with Erica Hartman-Horowitz, for their leadership and vision. Thank you to the sponsors of the Cleveland Israel Arts Connection, the Ro Green Foundation, the Leonard Krieger Fund of the Cleveland Foundation, Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, Zinner and Company, and the Consulate General of Israel in New York. Thank you also to the Arts Advisory Group and the Patron Society who support the Cleveland Israel Arts Connection throughout the year. This program would not exist without your support. Ron Leshem appears as part of the Israeli Speaker Series, sponsored by the Siegel Lifelong Learning and the Cleveland Israel Arts Connection. And now onto our program. Multi-talented Ron Leshem is a renowned screenwriter, TV producer, and an author. Leshem has written and produced many hit TV shows in Israel and the United States. He's the co-executive producer and co-creator of the Israeli TV show Euphoria, which was adapted for HBO. In 2020, Leshem wrote and co-created 2 dramatic TV shows. The groundbreaking drama Valley of Tears, Sha'at Ni'elah, is about Israel's Yom Kippur War and is currently streaming on HBO Max. Valley of Tears tells the incredible story of the 1973 war. The show received accolades for its innovation in recreating battle scenes and holds the record for the highest budget for any TV show produced in Israel to date. Leshem also wrote and co-created the Hulu series No Man's Land, for which takes place in the midst of the recent civil war in Syria, involving ISIS and the Kurds. Prior to moving to the US, Leshem was head of the content and programming for Keshet, one of Israel's main commercial TV networks. He was a producer of the successful Israeli TV show Hatufim, which later was adapted into the hit TV show Homeland. Leshem was also executive producer of NBC's TV drama Allegiance. As an author, Leshem won the Sapir Prize, Israel's top literary reward, for his novel Beaufort, which was on Israel's bestsellers list for 2 years. The book was adapted into a film by the same name and was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. A Tel Aviv native, Ron currently lives in the States and splits his time between Boston and Los Angeles. Ron will be taking questions later. Please submit your questions into the chat box located at the bottom of your screen. From now on, I will ask you also, please, to make sure that your Zoom is in gallery view if you want to see everybody. And again, please welcome Ron Leshem.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for this. And thank you for having me. And thanks, everyone, for being here.
Great to have you. And, I know it's been a traumatic 48 hours for everybody, but, I think what we want to focus on today is you sharing some information about just, I guess the history of television in Israel, how it's become the #1 exporter of TV shows to the US. Maybe we get started there.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, it's a tough week, and it's a challenging not to be at home. I used to fly back and forth to Israel because some of our projects are television and film productions are there, of course, but my family is there, everyone is there. And although I live right now in Boston, I used to go there every month, and the pandemic changes, and now what's going on in Israel, and it is so bothering for us, which is not only, I mean, we know how to handle Hamas. It is extremely depressing, like, to have your to run with your kids at 3 a.m. to the shelters, day and night, and it's and people, like, people in the U.S., a lot of people who do not, unlike this group, who are not really involved and not know what's going on in Israel, usually these days can just read a social media tweet and deciding they have an opinion without knowing anything, which is also very challenging for us. And the situation, of course, is so complicated because those people who are supporting what's going on right now, the regime in Gaza, and I just have to say this, I mean, those people who support a regime in Gaza who execute women for adultery, who execute gay people, who is non-democratic by any chance, but they're not only non-liberal, but it's an insane, brutal regime controlling Gaza, and the world is not really capable with digesting anything that is more complicated. And that brings us sometimes to the stories, because we create drama in order to try and explain the more complicated stories. And a lot of what we're creating in Israel is not, I mean, we're not really our fear, for me at least, my fear, more than the fear of the Gaza Hamas, which is, I mean, significant, but more than anything else is for the fragile society in Israel. And that is something that when each of our stories, when we write about the 73 war, when we write about, it's always about the Israeli society. And we are so fragile that if we will not be careful and sensitive enough to understand how we are reuniting this society with everyone who's part of it, we will find ourselves in a situation which is a kind of a Yugoslavia type of a collapse, which is, and what we are seeing these couple of few days, like in the streets of Israel, within Israel, with the Israeli Arabs, this is a glimpse into what might happen in the future if we don't work as a society. And through the years, I've been I've been an editor for newspapers, for media, running television channels, and the idea of trying to convince people to think about, to care about, to be aware of, was always there for me. But when I realized that the way to influence people, to share thoughts with them, and just kind of force them to think. It's not that when we're creating drama, we're not coming with a political agenda. We're just coming with the idea that we want people to be aware of something. Usually it's more of the social sides of the Israeli society, and digest it and work out our grief and our rage and our fears and try it together to find this common ground. And this is what, because there's something so unique in Israel with the fact that you cannot create a drama that is a niche. You can never create, because it's financially never makes sense. You have a tiny community, tinier than New Jersey, when it comes to Hebrew speaking households, because our population do not watch Hebrew speaking television. The ultra Orthodox do not watch Hebrew. We have such a tiny community and we don't have the budget, so it forces us to create a campfire type of shows. And when you create a campfire type of a show for an audience who is so neurotic and gets bored so easily, you are also edgy. You are also forcing your audience we're challenging your audience. So we do create, I think we're capable of creating this explosive dialogue through the drama, trying to build the future Israel. And in a time where all of us as Israelis feel like the entire country is on our shoulders, and if we stop holding it, it will collapse. We're so involved. You know how it is. We're 24/7 in the news and everything. Drama is the comfort for us. And in many ways, the thing for me personally, as a person who has always been anxious as a kid, even suffering from anxiety. When I was in first grade, my mother lost her brother in the war, and I grew up in this home that will never be the same. And growing up as such a kid, drama was always for me the kind of shelter, because in drama there's lots of solace. I mean, every disaster plays a role, comes for a reason, and plays a role and you can control it. When you're writing drama, you do play with this. It's not only that every disaster plays a role in the journey of the character to becoming better, but it's also kind of controllable. So I chose drama in many aspects, and I love the part of it of being alone and writing, and I love the part of it of being an executive who is running a show. That's part. But the crazy thing is that the Israeli television started. It's such a young industry. We've been in 48, just when Israel was born, they were always in the Knesset. They were always debating, do we need a television network? The US already had tons, even local stations, and Israel was still fighting over the idea, do we want a television station? Now, I think one thing that Ben-Gurion was really afraid of, he was afraid of many things. He never allowed television in Israel. But one thing he was afraid of is that the Jews who came from Arab countries, when they'll have TV sets, they'll be naturally listening all the time to this Arab propaganda from Arab networks around us, instead of watching the Hebrew broadcaster from Jerusalem. And that would socially, not in the political sense, but socially would make it even harder to create a melting pot. That's one thing. The second thing is he said that socially, he was a kind of a good socialist in many ways. And socially, he felt that, and that was leading us all the time, the poor will not be able to have a TV set. And later on, by the way, when there was a TV station, first one in Israel, in the 70s, the government was really worried about the fact that the rich people are going to have color TV and the poor people are going to have black and white TV. So the government decided to air all the films on black and white. Even when they bought US Hollywood films that were colored, they didn't want people, the rich people, to own, and that was our nation's DNA at that time. And it wasn't so. Only at the end of the 60s we had a first television station, but it was the educational television state for schools. Then in the 70s we had a kind of a government owned, with concert of classical music, and it was not really a television industry. And only in the 90s we started building a TV industry, which had first time ever cable networks in the 90s, just yesterday practically. And also for the first time commercial networks like Keshet, Reshet, 12, 13. It's the our NBC, CBS, Fox, and ABC. And it was so young, but the idea was the fact that because we don't have money, we don't have budgets to produce. First of all, we have to be very initiative and we have to take lots of risks, but also we have to try and establish connections abroad. Because basically the drama industry, more than the films, by the way, films, I mean, if you're a filmmaker, doing films, you would fly back and forth to festivals abroad and you will meet foreign speaking audiences. But in television, that was a very, that was the television industry until basically yesterday was the opposite of globalization. Because what happened was the Hollywood writers and creators were writing shows about Americans on American soil, speaking American language, and they were creating it in Hollywood and just selling it to 190 countries without even bothering to think about the audience outside. On other territories like Japan or Sweden, you would always have a writer who is writing for his community, but he has so much money to produce shows that he never had the urge to fly somewhere with his show. And in many aspects, we were kind of the first to be traveling abroad with our shows. It's true that there were, I mean, yes, there were South American shows in the US and there were soap operas from Turkey, wherever, whatever, but that's not really globalizations. What we created as Israeli creators was the first community of people who are drama executives, drama producers, drama writers who meet constantly, like 4 times a year, and share ideas and sometimes produce together. And it gave us the benefit to be kind of, this is very strange, the first ones to know the executives and directors and writers in television in Argentina, in South Africa, in China, in Korea, in India, and all over Europe. That was very powerful. Now, today we stand in a point where the entire TV industry in the world is changing and it's becoming I think it's this momentum that we are facing right now is the most dramatic moment in TV history, more than the switch to color TV. And that is because for years, we were waiting to know whether at the end of the day, there'll only be one Netflix that will control everything, like one Google. We only have one Google. Or eventually, will we have a real competition? Right now, we already know since last year that it's truly going to be a competition. An American home right now has 4 different streaming services at the same time. So Netflix, who had a strategy to say, looking for someone to Netflix with, it's going to be a verb. They said, we're going to create a verb. To Netflix with is going to be watching television. And they failed. They succeeded, of course, but they failed because there's going to be competition, which is good for everyone. And now the idea that when we are seeing how American audiences watch Tisel, not only Fauda, watch Tisel, not a Jewish audience. And it's incredible because it marks a new generation where, unlike American executives, we're always saying that the only way to create a show in the US would be to tell an American story on American soul with American characters. Now, because the US is creating 500 shows a year and they all disappear, they all feel the same, those who are standing out are those who are bringing new territories, new smell, new excitement, new adventures. And the young audience is so open to foreign shows, and that is something. Older audiences in the US would always watch the show dubbed, for example. And the young viewers would always show it with subtitles. They are capable of watching, by the way, because the Generation Z and even millennials, they have their short attention And multitasking is so hectic that they, even when they watch an American series in English, they have subtitles. So they're so used to subtitles that they don't mind watching a Hebrew or Danish or Swedish show. And that created a new generation for the Israeli industry. So I think a lot of us are creating shows abroad. I create shows in Korea and in France, but a lot of us are always struggling for a chance to come back to Israel and create our Israeli shows, because we do feel that this is our way to work out everything that we need to fight for Israel and for our families. That's part of it, I think.
Okay, great. So Israel, continues to grow as an exporter of TV shows. You started off, you were served in the IDF. How many years did you serve?
6.
6 years.
Yeah, but I was an intelligence officer, which really helped me later on in creating drama. But
so you were intelligence. You were a journalist. You were a TV executive. What attracted you to screenwriting?
it's so I think you remember when we had the second Intifada in the year 2000, and I was a journalist, and that was I think that was the most emotionally exhausting days of my life, because in order to be a journalist and a news editor, when every day buses are exploding, every day restaurants explode, and you sit and edit the first front page of the newspaper, and on your desk you have tons of photos from the terror attacks, and from you basically the grief and the sadness, where I couldn't handle this anymore. I mean, my dream was I should be a journalist. I knew I'm going to be a journalist, but I was so exhausted of that I couldn't go on emotionally. So in a very strange way, I said, well, I need to move to television, and go to create this escapism, like reality shows. Even just I'm going to be an executive for television. It's going to be after years of wars. I'm going to be doing the Israeli Idol type of shows, and like it was kind of me trying to reinvent myself and escape to new directions. But since I wrote at that point, I wrote my first novel, and the novel was adapted to a film, and the film was nominated for the American Oscars. I kind of always I had a schizophrenia between I love being an executive for a network, and the most powerful network in Israel, meaning that we have influence and we can share stories and we can invent things. We have huge budgets, and I love working with people. But at the same time, the beautiful thing of like it was more fun for me after the Oscars. I left the ceremony in LA and I flew to the UK. I was taking a train to Leeds University to meet with 20 people at the university, just sit down and talk with 20 people after the Oscars. And I was thinking on the train, I'm thinking, what do I prefer for myself? And I felt like, well, I want to write. I want to write a book. I want to visit Leeds University even more than I want to be. And I decided to quit my day job and just start writing. But writing a novel is so, it comes with so much solitude, the loneliness of it. It's insane. And you're also totally exposed. You're totally out, and you're alone when you get bad critics, when you get like you're alone. And there's something about, and I also really wanted to have influence. I've been playing in all the fields. I was writing a speech for the prime minister on the one day and be able to talk to him when he's on the airplane from a trip to Poland, trying to convince him to dedicate a speech to the occasion, for example. And I felt, wow, I have a direct line to ministers and the government, being able to convince them. But at the same time, I enjoy just being with myself, with the tiniest stories and nuances, and being alone. And I didn't know how to decide between the two. And when I tried for the first time to write a TV show, and I realized that I'm going to enjoy all of it. I'm going to enjoy the ability to influence, but at the same time, I'm going to be creating my own worlds and everything. and it even comes with the benefit of like seeing the world and traveling with your shows. And I just fell in love with it, and I couldn't replace it with anything else. And I mean, in a strange way, the U.S. is less open for us as foreigners, as writers, than other places. So at first, Europe and South America were hugging us really quickly. I mean, the French executives at Canal Plus, they look at me and say, "Well, you can write a French show. You can write a French character. If you're really attracted to it, you will be researching and exploring so deep in order to be able to." And while American executive will always tell me, "You can try it in American college, kid. You've never been to an American college. You don't know the nuances to write a flesh and blood truly." And I'm trying to tell them, no, what I'm attracted to write will always be my alter ego and the things I've missed and I didn't have a chance to do. Just when I'm too passionate about something, I need to write it. So we had success abroad, and now we are starting truly like our first steps in Hollywood, trying to combine all worlds together.
Okay. Choosing stories to tell, tell me about that. I mean, you know, it's
So you know what? For me, it's always about my alter ego or people I want to be, people I'm attracted to, and things I need to like work out for myself or digest. But unlike writing workshop that will always tell you look for the stories in your family, write about yourself. Of course, I'll be writing at the end of the day about myself and the underline, but I always write about. I always use the writing process to go on a journey and be someone else and be someone I really want. Like one day a king and one day a prostitute and one day a warrior in the combat zone. I've never been a warrior because I was kind of in the intelligence and Mossad and A200, which is the Israeli equivalent of the NSA. So I never had a chance to be a warrior in combat. But because my friends were, and I lost my uncle, and I lost friends, I needed to understand like the existence of that. So I wrote this. I always write what I need to explore. It's the world of writing is the wrong word to describe it, because it's more of a kind of exploring. It's not the actual choosing words type of thing, right?
okay. All right, great. So I think what everybody's wanting to hear and learn more about is Valley of Tears, and I was hooked from day one, and just a fantastic show. Just you know, every minute of it was just my adrenaline and the energy, and just everything was kept going and going, and every scene was like, what's going to happen next, and what's going to happen to that actor or that person. So maybe I think you've got a little video on an introduction to Valley of Tears, but if you want to talk about your personal connection, and then obviously, there's a lot of behind the scenes that people don't know goes on. I look at that one scene, and you're looking at that open field, and there's like hundreds and thousands, hundreds of tanks everywhere, and so for a show to be put out in Israel on such a small budget, which compared to what US shows budgets are,
Yeah.
maybe you can shed some light on that.
It's interesting because, well, the thing is, yeah, our budget, as you know, it's tinier than the budget that a US series would have for refreshments on set, which is really ridiculous. But yeah, the thing is that, and even this show, it wasn't expensive at all. It wasn't even a budget. Wasn't even third of what a European show would cost. But we were fighting for 10 years to convince producers and channels to buy this show and create a show. For 10 years, I was like begging people. And they always said, well, no one wants this drama. No one wants to hear these sad stories about the war. No one wants to episodic, periodic piece. And it was impossible. At the end of the day, these producers, not myself, these producers had a profit of $7 million. I didn't, but but it was, and it's always like this. By the way, it's not like, even with Euphoria, I was fighting in LA for 6 years to convince someone to believe in it, and everyone said no. And only at the end of the day, after 6 years, now it's one of the, according to Google, one of the 7th most Googled about shows in the US and in Europe. But for Valley of Tears, we were really struggling to convince people to give us a chance to write a show about post-trauma, about this moment where the Israeli society was dying and rebirthing. It's a kind of a new, like the first Israel had died at 2 p.m. with the siren, and new Israel was born, and we wanted to explore this. And but no, everyone said no to it. Now, even when we were able to convince like our first investors, it looked like something that will never happen, because but you mentioned the tanks, for example. I mean, you cannot, the Israeli audience, they're obsessed with like fact checking. Like every day we were under, honestly, hundreds of complaints saying, oh, this chocolate bar was launched that winter and you showed it as if it was in the fall or whatever. But the thing is, with the tanks that were fighting both in the Syrian side and in the Israeli side in 73 do not exist anymore. And we didn't know how to get these tanks. And for a while, we thought maybe buying it from people who are selling it in the US on Craigslist, because in the US, people do have tanks in their backyard as a collection or whatever. We thought maybe buying this, and the Israeli government never allowed us to import tanks for shooting. It was a mess. Eventually, we were able to create an engine to one Syrian and one Israeli, but you needed hundreds of tanks. And the interesting thing is that Israeli animators and computer generating imaging artists are really successful in the US. If you go into Pixar and Marvel, you would see a lot of Israelis working there, but they never have a chance ever to create what they love creating to an Israeli screen, because we don't have the budget for that. And we wanted to give a chance for the first time for the computer generated imaging artists to work, the Israeli ones, to work on an Israeli show. So I can give you a glimpse to how it looks, and how do they do that, maybe in a second. And I just say, for us, it's not, you would say, well, it's not, the important thing would not be like the production value, but more the sense of what we are trying to create emotionally there. But it is important for us, the opportunity to create this production value, because this is the future of our industry. If we will have the budgets to create periodic piece, because if you and I want to write a show about Tel Aviv in the British days, whatever, or about King David, we can't build a set. It's too expensive. We need to create computer imaging. And in order to create computer imaging, I'll show this with no sound so we can continue talking. In order to create computer imaging, this is how we create it. We just draw the tanks with computer. It looks really believable when you watch it on screen, and Hollywood is doing this all the time with blue screens and others, and we never have a chance. I think that if we will have in the coming years the ability to create in this way, it will open a whole new way of storytelling for us. It's not that we will not continue writing shtisel stories about people in a room, but we will also have the ability to create periodic piece about the kingdom of David or whatever, because we will be able to create it through this, like people create Game of Thrones. And if at the end of the day, this will not be too expensive and we will be able to create this, it means that eventually we will have a Hollywood production value in a cheaper way. And the only thing that will count is the writing. We will not be inferior. I mean, if the writing is going to be good, we will win. Right now, we never had this opportunity. I mean, this is, of course, never. We didn't have an the Air Force or the Syrian Air Force on our side. It's all computer generated. So that's a part of it. Now, to your question, as for the motivation for writing a show and everything, You know, you always choose when you start working on a show, and I already said, well, for me, it was more of the social story of Israel. But when you choose to write such a show, you always ask yourself, okay, who do I want to be? What kind of a person or personality I want to be? And then you choose the stories. And I was working with my friends, we were writing together, and each of us was bringing his own stories. Amit brought his father's story. Amit and I we met as intelligence officers, but we started as being in this unit of Avinoam, who's the tapping unit guy who's listening to the enemy. And we grew up on this very fresh memory of what happened over there with the disaster of the A200 outpost over there. And Amit's father was actually in the war. He was one of those young officers who was 100% convinced that the war is going to break out. He never knew that the generals are hiding this from the prime minister Golda Meir, and he was in another outpost, not this one, but it was a part for us. It was a part of a story that we wanted to digest because it was our unit. It was usually we don't write about our unit. Usually we write about. I mean, I wrote about combat soldiers in Lebanon, which was never myself. It was my alter ego. Here, it was myself. But with the way we chose the stories was, one, the fact that we wanted to show post-trauma. And we wanted to say that there is another kind of hero. When you live in a country where people are, you can be an accountant or an engineer or an artist, and you're going to sit at 1 p.m., 1:55, eating lunch with your kids, and a moment later you're going to get you hear a siren. An hour later you are being killed or killing people or whatever. And we wanted to say that the bravery and the boldness and being not only just being killed, killing, whatever, but also suffering from struggling with PTSD. And we chose the hill that we were telling about, the Tel Saki Hill, as a story with the bunker, because these were the first guys in Israel who were really fighting to be recognized as mental trauma casualties. And it took the army 25 years to recognize them, but they were bravely sharing their stories about what they are suffering all these years. So a lot of what we chose was about PTSD, and a lot of what we chose was about who is the first Israel who was failing and dying that moment, and who was the new Israel. And we wanted to ask ourselves, after that disaster, after that trauma, after everything we suffered and our mistakes and our arrogancy and whatever, we promised ourselves at that moment to be better people, to be a better country. Are we fulfilling this? Where are we fulfilling this, and where we are not, and how can we be better? Because when you're creating in 2020, you're creating a show about 1973, it can't be a show that could have been done in 1980. It needs to have a perspective of today. It needs to tell something about today. Otherwise, the answer of why are you doing this now cannot be, oh, because we got budget now, or because it's doable. No, it's because you have to know why you're telling this in 2020, and that was the social sides of Israel.
Okay, great, thanks. In terms of accuracy and the actual, the story from the beginning to, I'm hearing the chatter, and them not believing him and trying to throw him out the room, and through the whole process, how, in terms of accuracy, what's, how much of the actual story is real versus not?
So we had a rule for ourselves to to make sure that everything that happens on screen is accurate, but at the same time not to use real names for characters, and not to create a character that is based on one person, but rather, because we didn't want to say, okay, the hero is, we wanted just to be we didn't choose numbers for the units. What we said is that we're going to make sure that each character is based on 2 or 3 real people that we are combining into one, and not giving them the original name. So it is, but the reality stays totally accurate. Yes.
All right, great. So in Israeli society, there's a lot of hesitancy or reluctance to talk about trauma, wars, the Holocaust, things that have happened over the years. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting that you're saying this, and I mean, you know it, and you've been working with the IDF on, and part of it is about our memories and our narratives and the way we treat our wounded. But you know what? I feel that we are not really. Everyone thinks that we are practically working out our traumas and our stories, and it's not really the case. I think unlike if you compare that to the Vietnam War, for example, it was the same years. So many novels and films are still being made about Vietnam, while we only had one small film made on the Yom Kippur War. It's our biggest trauma. It changed Israel. It changed the Middle East, and we only had one film about it, no TV series, and I think only 1.5 novels that worth mentioning about the war. And it is because we have a lot of forgotten wars, and the more traumatic it is, we are not facing our. You know what? It's in a way it's like, and I'm not comparing at all the war to that. Of course not. I'm sorry if it sounds this way, but our parents grew up without being able to hear a word at home about the Holocaust. It was a forbidden subject to mention. Their parents were never sharing anything because they were ashamed in a way, and they felt weak, and it wasn't. No one told any stories in the U.S. and in Canada. I think that Jewish populations were more open to talk about it, but in Israel it wasn't. It was never said. And then when the Eichmann trial happened, and people were hearing on the radio for the first time the testimonies, for the first time people realized what their parents were struggling with. It was a moment that changed Israel, because suddenly, I mean, our parents couldn't believe the stories. They never learned that at school or something. And in a way, that's what we're doing constantly. Like our children and younger generations, they don't hear about our traumas and the Yom Kippur War, and something else. I mean, in a way, but when finally someone gave us the green light to produce it, yes, it was the most. It broke all rating records for the public broadcaster for drama ever. But the thing is, and you know what? People are thirsty to learn, because we were checking every morning, all these months when we were on air, we were checking the statistics on Wikipedia in Israel. You have the Twitter of the Israeli Wikipedia. You see what are the 5 highest, most searched pages on Wikipedia. And it was always at least 2 of the 5 were from the show. The Black Panthers, this unit, that unit, Yom Kippur War, the show. People were constantly reading the stories. That was our goal. Now, I think that in a way, the Israeli society for decades, at the beginning, when Israel was born, our writers were always writing about the army. It was day and night. We were writing about the army. We had military bands on the radio, biggest hits. But after we lost the confidence in the military in 73, and then in 82, for the first time, we had a war that was not a consensus. These writers that are our most important writers were too afraid to touch the military because they didn't want to criticize it, but it was too complicated to deal with. It wasn't a consensus anymore. So for 2 decades then, you had no stories about the army, no films, no TV series, no nothing for 20 years during the 80s and the 90s. And and I think my generation, we started to force ourselves to deal with these stories and to rediscover the way that we need to talk about how this influence our children, how this influence our society, how this is shaping who we are as people. So kind of it's I hope we will be able to like historical stories and not only wars but our to make kind of a national reckoning with stories. I tried to do it with Incitement, the films. I mean, it's not about, it's about the Israeli society creating a dialogue about what it is going through.
So before we move on, I'm going to start just making some suggestions. If people can throw some questions in the chat box. We mentioned Ron's got a hard stop at 2:00, so please throw any questions you have. One thing I'm going to ask, because I'm very anxious and eager to know, is what are you working on? What projects are in the pipeline? Is there another Valley of Tears coming about?
So thank you for asking this. I mean, the sad thing about television is that when you write a story, you write one, but when you develop stories, you develop 10. And you never know which of the 10 is going to be produced when. And it's not just, I mean, I'm crying about how long it takes. It's not only us. It's, I mean, my friend Matthew Weiner, who created the Mad Men, he wrote the pilot of Mad Men in 1994, and it was produced in 2007. And I think even with Game of Thrones on HBO, when they filmed the pilot based on a book, they needed 8 more years to work on it before it was aired. So I'm not complaining, but I think for us, we must work on 10 different stories and not being depressed about getting so many no's. I'm not writing 10, but I'm developing 10. So basically, I don't know which will be greenlighted when, but the Valley of Tears, we really want to create the next season. And it depends on HBO Max, and they didn't decide yet because this is their decision. They're the financier. If they say no, we can't go anywhere else because it's with the second season. But we are waiting to hear from them. For me, and it's always a debate. Do you want to create? What do you want to do as a second season? And originally we thought we should write about the Sinai Desert because I mean, we even wrote and couldn't film because we didn't have the budget. We wrote storylines in the Sinai Desert. But I think that if we do get green light, what I really wish I could do is do something else. I think it is more important, and that would be take the same characters and meet them not only, I mean, also create new characters, but with the same characters, meet them 9 years later. Some of them got married, some of them had kids, their life had changed, the country has changed, the world has changed, the war had changed, and you meet them in 82, June 82, and the next war breaks out. And being able to see the country and the wars from that one war to the other, and being the only place where you must, like, you have no other choice but hearing the siren and go fight for your community and to save your kids. And for us, it would be really good if we can create the next seasons and see how the Israeli society is being shaped and the war is being shaped and the Middle East is becoming more and more extreme. And it's, I think, but it depends on HBO Max.
Okay, well, keep us posted.
Thanks.
So some questions are starting to come through. One is just coming from Sharon. She mentioned, you talked about these shows being able to communicate Israeli society in a sympathetic way. But is this the case? Are the shows good PR for Israel? Are they actually creating empathy for Israel? What can be done differently to help the world understand?
So thank you, Sharon. I think, the one thing in drama that you would agree with me is that when you have a show with the protagonists being the soldiers or Israeli characters, and protagonists, it means that the audience is invested in these characters and love these guys and care for them and wish they're not dead, and the enemy is the enemy. It's no matter how hard we will try to bring even like conflicts in it or everything, at the end of the day, you create empathy because you create this. It's not even a show where like you can say that in Fauda you have two different voices and you boldly you have the narratives of the other side. When you create this show or you create and your protagonists are, these are the people, these are the characters you're invested in, so that create that there's no doubt that it is doing good because you like you're showing that are. And even by the way, when I wrote Buford, it's you see these warriors when they cry, when they struggle, when they, that's one thing. But the other thing that you know our strongest tool basically is the fact that we have the freedom to create and create art. Now, art would never be art. You can write, you know, you can write something that looks like a screenplay and use it for commercial purposes, propaganda, entertainment, everything. But it will only be art if it puts a mirror up in the audience's face and yourself as a writer and force you to be bothered or disturbed and worried and ask questions with the national reckoning or whatever. People on the other side, and this is my friends, my Muslim friends in the Middle East. I always tell them, I mean, you watch the TV industry all around the Muslim world in the Middle East, and you say, why can't you have not only? It's not even freedom. It's not that you don't have even a freedom to express and digest. It's all about propaganda. Whatever they're creating is television. It's all about propaganda. It's all about how much they are right and how much they're the victims, and it's always one-dimensional. And this is not art, so it will never work. We are so proud, and this is why I think we're being hugged internationally for the fact that we do have the freedom even to just fight among ourselves about for ideas, which is a great thing. And I think that's the only way to go. Oh, you're muted. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for that. Another question has come through. Are there generic similarities between the traumas of different wars, or is each war's trauma unique?
That's a very interesting question. I think there are so many. It's only in recent years it's being really researched, and there are things that are typical, and but it's interesting to see how each war has its different traumas, both in the society and in the front lines, and that and the way with the context of the social environment, how it influences. For example, you have wars that a moment later, a lot of people go to religion as an answer, and you have other wars where a lot of people choose to leave religion because of the war. It's really interesting to explore.
Okay, thanks. So I know we're running out of time, Debbie. Does anyone else have any questions before we finish up?
And I'm sorry for the time. I'd love to be back and whatever, but it was like originally it was 12:30, so I thought I have like 90 minutes, but then so I have a presentation, but it was sorry about that. I hope to come in person, but
yeah, please God, we'll see you soon. You're always welcome in Cleveland.
Thanks.
Anytime.
I love Cleveland.
So Ron, just thank you for being here. We know it's there's a note that just came through from Dan. Your passion and honesty is a gift. So thank you.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
We praying for everybody in Israel for the safety. And, it's just been incredible having you on this call. It's wonderful seeing all of our members and seeing you all in virtual rooms as always. But hopefully we'll be able to see you in person very, very soon. And, you know, please mark your calendars for some wonderful upcoming events, which you should be seeing on your screen now. And yeah, just again, thank you. And
Thank
oh
you
wait,
for
one
everything.
question just came through. What happened to Pine Nut?
So we had two of these, and they're safe, and we don't have an answer for, like, it was a metaphor. A lot of people really in Israel really didn't like, they appreciate the fact that he's holding on this animal. Whatever. It was a metaphor to see how he's struggling with human beings, but so plot wise, I don't have an answer, but the actual animal is fine.
Safe and sound.
Thanks.
Okay, good.
Hope to see you soon.
Thank you, and thank
Thanks
you.
for everything. Thanks for being here. Stay safe.
Thank you. Be
Bye
safe,
bye.
be well, be
Thanks.
healthy, and thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful
Thanks.
afternoon.